Jane Eyre begins with Jane's childhood. She's orphaned at a very early age and is brought up by her aunt. Her aunt is really cruel to her and her cousins bully her. After a violent outburst at one of her cousins, Jane is locked in the Red Room, a terrifying place where Jane is restrained and she believes that she sees a ghost there. After this outburst, she's sent to Lowood Hall, a school run by the cruel Mr. Brocklehurst. The conditions there are terrible, but nevertheless, Jane makes a friend in Helen, a girl slightly older than her, and Miss Temple, one of the teachers. After being there a little while, things get much worse. The cold, the lack of food, leads to a typhus epidemic in the school, and Helen dies. After this epidemic, though, some of the terrible conditions are revealed, and Mr. Brocklehurst is dismissed from the school. And at last, Jane becomes a teacher at Lowood once she grows up. After leaving Lowood, Jane takes a position as a governess in Thornfield Hall. She's there, becomes very comfortable with the other staff, people such as Mrs. Fairfax, and with her charge, a young girl called Adele. She also becomes very friendly with her employer, Mr. Rochester, and they develop an unusual, surprisingly frank relationship where she's not afraid to tell him what she feels and what she thinks about him, despite their very stark social difference. Now, things at Thornfield Hall aren't all great. There are a few mysteries happening. It's a big Gothic house, and we start to get some unusual occurrences. There's distant laughter that's often heard. There's a part of the house that Jane is told not to go in. There are strange incidents. A guest is attacked. And then one night, someone sets fire to Mr. Rochester's bed, which Jane helps to put out. All of these incidents are blamed on Grace Poole, one of the servants, who is implied drinks too much. Now, Mr. Rochester is in a relationship, it seems, with a very rich, slightly shallow woman called Blanche. Jane realizes that she has some feelings for Mr. Rochester and she becomes jealous of Blanche, but she's not going to let it interfere with her life. Much to her surprise, Mr. Rochester finally dismisses Blanche and proposes to Jane. She's surprised at first and almost turns him down, but then eventually she relents. Just before her wedding, a stranger appears in her room and rips her wedding veil. Again, this is dismissed and everyone tells her not to worry about it, but Jane can't help feeling uneasy. And she's every right to, because on the day of the wedding, a man called Mr. Mason turns up and calls the whole thing off, saying that Mr. Rochester is already married to his sister, Bertha. Mr. Rochester explains to everyone, he married Bertha when he was very young, and she has since gone mad. It's her who lives in the attic of the house. It's her who makes the strange noises, who set fire to his bed. He asks Jane to live with him anyway, but she refuses. This is absolutely against her principles, and she runs away. Jane wanders for some time and is in a really bad condition until at last she's taken in by the Rivers family, St. John, Mary, and Diana. It's slowly revealed that they're actually, by a great coincidence, Jane's cousins, and that there's an inheritance waiting for her. St. John is a minister. He's very religious, he's very cold. He wants to go to India to be a missionary, and he asks Jane to come with him. At first she's all right with this, but then he proposes to her, saying it would be best if she goes as his wife. Again, Jane's not okay with this. This is not what she believes in, this kind of convenient marriage. And just as she's debating it, she hears Rochester's voice calling her supernaturally. She decides at last it's time to return to Thornfield. But when she gets there, it's completely burnt down, and she learns that Bertha set fire to the house and ultimately committed suicide. She hunts down Rochester and finds him greatly weakened. He's disabled and he has lost his eyesight. But now at last, Jane has money and he is free to marry, so they can be together at last on a much more equal footing. This is a coming-of-age story for Jane. She starts out as a child, unloved, and finally comes to a place where she can be happily married. She's not your traditional Gothic heroine. She's not particularly pretty, and while she's very smart, she's often a little bit sassy. Sometimes she says what she thinks in a society where women aren't supposed to do that, particularly not governesses. She also has a great temper within her, which we see unleashed right at the beginning when she attacks her cousin. Throughout the novel, she's looking at ways to subdue that temper and trying to master her own feelings. But at the same time, she realizes she doesn't want to completely quash them, and she needs to find a happy balance. Rochester is Jane's love interest in this novel, and he's what we call a Byronic hero, which means he's dark, he's brooding, he's mysterious. Once again, he's not quite the handsome hero. Several times it's mentioned how ugly he actually is, but yet he's inevitably charismatic somehow. He's got a very dark past, and through the first half of the novel we kind of get a sense of it without ever knowing quite what it is. But then it's finally revealed, his marriage to Bertha, and his marriage to Bertha has really cursed him. He married her while he was very young, and he didn't get to know her very well. There's a sense he was slightly pushed into it. Over time, though, Bertha showed herself to be unfaithful and, in his words, to be mad. And so it's taken him a long time to move past that. He's a patriarchal figure and tends to talk down to people and demands that they behave in certain ways, which Jane finds quite difficult. He needs to come down from being the patriarch, as he is at the start of the novel, to being an equal with his wife, ultimately Jane. Bertha Mason is a fascinating character in Jane Eyre. So she is Rochester's first wife, the one who is the mad woman in the attic. And within the novel itself, she's a kind of a creature of Gothic horror. She's lurking there in the background the whole time. And then when she appears, she's described in very monstrous terms. But some critics like to look at Bertha and say, what if we actually consider her as a person? What if we consider her backstory? She has a singular place in this novel as being a woman of colour, which nobody else has. She is also described as being sexually promiscuous, which in a Victorian society isn't permissible for a woman. Is there a sense that we could see Bertha as a double for Jane if Jane hadn't curbed the passion that she had so early on in the novel? Is it a warning and perhaps even a criticism that women who are too volatile in their passions will ultimately be reprimanded? Just as Bertha and Jane have an interesting dynamic in this novel, we can also look at St. John and Rochester in parallel. So St. John, and that's spelt St. John, but it's pronounced St. John as a name, is the minister who is Jane's distant cousin, who asks Jane to marry him at the end of the novel. St. John is the exact opposite of Rochester. He's cold, he's heartless, he isn't emotionally engaged in anything, it seems. He briefly mentions a girl that he quite fancies, but even then presses it down. He's repressing everything that he can. When he offers himself to Jane, this is the sensible option. If she's to reject Rochester and to reject passion and feeling, St. John makes sense. But this is proof that Jane isn't quite about absolutely rejecting these ideas of passion and enthusiasm. It's got to be a nice medium, so she rejects St. John in favour of Rochester ultimately. Jane Eyre was published in 1847. It was written by Charlotte Brontë, but published under the pseudonym of Currer Bell. Brontë grew up in Yorkshire. She was the daughter of a clergyman, and in time she became a governess. Her sisters, Anne and Emily Brontë, were also novelists, and they all published their work under male pseudonyms. Like many 19th century novelists, Brontë was very concerned with social issues of the day. So in situations such as Lowood School, we see the terrible conditions that children were put through. This is similar to many of Charles Dickens's novels. Particularly, we see the cruel conditions the children live in, while at the same time those who run the school, Mr. Brocklehurst and his family, are living in luxury and have fabulous clothing and all luxuries that they could want. Brontë also engages with the great difficulty of working life, saying how millions are in silent revolt and how difficult it is to move between the different class strata. So Jane is somebody who is, although brought up in quite an aristocratic family, has very low beginnings in Lowood School and then as a governess. But as a governess, she's in a peculiar place because she's slightly above the servants, people like Mrs. Fairfax, but she's not quite at the level of Mr. Rochester. This makes it a very unusual place for her, and she doesn't quite fit in on either of the different levels. When she finally does marry Mr. Rochester, she's at first concerned that this is going to be something of a condescension to him, and it's only until the end, when he has taken a step down from his position of luxury and she has taken a step up, that really they're at an equal stage and that they can be together. The development of Jane's self-worth is incredibly important in this novel. At the beginning, she's so badly treated by her family that when she meets some people who like her, she will do literally anything for their love, which she says to Helen and Miss Temple. She has to learn, though, that love at any cost isn't okay. So when Mr. Rochester asks if she'll be with him despite the fact that he's married, she says no, because that goes against her moral code and it would demean her as a person. Ultimately, she needs to find a balance, somewhere where she can not have to be as meek and as suppliant as Helen is, but where she can be her own strong self. Finally, she says that she is Rochester's life just as much as he is her life, and she has found a place of self-worth from which she can be with him. There is a strong social commentary in this novel, particularly in terms of gender. Now, the gender roles in the Victorian era mean that women have to be meek and be compliant. Jane is neither of these things. She's feisty, she's fiery, she's rebellious. There's a sense perhaps she ought to be more like a character like Helen Burns, who is very quiet. But this isn't who Jane is, and although she does have to curb her temper a little bit, she can still find a society in which that is allowed, which Life with Rochester does give her. But there's always the warning of characters like Bertha Mason, who are too tempestuous, too fiery, and are ultimately incarcerated. The men in this novel all act with a patriarchal superiority. Even somebody like Mr. Rochester, who's a good character, speaks down to Jane a little bit and tells her what she should and should not do. On the other side, we see communities of women emerging. So it's very like a family, but even when they're not related. So Jane, Miss Temple, and Helen build their own little society, as do Jane and Miss Fairfax and Adele, and indeed Jane and Mary and Diana towards the end of the novel. Jane Eyre is a novel that draws on many of the popular genres of the 19th century. It is, in part, a Bildungsroman. This is the genre wherein we see the development of a single character from childhood to maturity. It is also a social commentary, as Bronte comments on many important issues of the day. But it's also a Gothic novel, although it adapts many of the major tropes of Gothic. So normally in Gothic, we have a supernatural element that dominates the book. Here we have the vibe, and we do have a few supernatural incidences. But the supernatural isn't nearly as frightening as the real. So the strange voices, what turns out to be Bertha Mason, actually the things that are really frightening here are the lies that people tell each other, the cruel treatment of one human to another. There is a great deal of symbolism in this novel. Two of the most interesting ones are fire and the colour red, which are obviously linked. So Jane as a child is locked in the red room, and it's there that she sees the ghost of her uncle. Red is connected in this novel with passion and with fury, but also with these elements taking over, being out of control. Fire is particularly connected with Bertha, but sometimes we see it echoed through into Jane's character as well. When Bertha's emotions overcome her and she can't control herself, she sets fire to things. So when she sets fire to Rochester's bed, and of course there's a symbolic sexual overtone there as well. She also finally sets fire to Rochester's house and brings down the entire family. There is a sense that this fire and these red themes that run throughout suggest the volatile and the dangerous. Bronte uses a very interesting device to show us some of Jane's inner thoughts, which is to describe Jane's drawings. This creates an ekphrasis, which is when a piece of literature describes a work of art. These drawings are dark, they're gloomy, they have ominous images in them, like a sunken ship and a dead body. These help to show Jane's inner self, the darkness, the difficulties that she is feeling, but also Rochester values them, which is incredibly important because it shows that he knows her deepest, darkest secrets. Another way these are incredibly useful is that Jane often draws portraits of the other characters in the novel, and this allows us to see them through her eyes as we get her reflection on who they are as people.